When I try cases, there's nothing I like more than turning to the jury and saying, don't believe me, believe what the other side says and take them at their word. Well, guess what? I think Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, has just made a terrible strategic mistake that's going to help us in the Second Amendment community by virtue of his proposal of a 28th Amendment to essentially abolish the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Stay tuned. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of The Four Box, a proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of the best-selling new book, Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Can Teach Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. Today, Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, has captured headlines by virtue of proposing a 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution that would have the effect of gutting the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms. We'll get to some of the specifics in just a second. But the reality is, this is a PR stunt. But it turns out it's actually arguably very good for the Second Amendment community. Because it seems to me that by Newsom proposing that the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms has to be amended to allow the anti-gun community to get where they want to get in terms of restricting our right to keep and bear arms, he's admitting that the Constitution has to first be amended, which of course is impossible for all intents and purposes when it comes to various things, including the Second Amendment. So this is a strategic mistake, and I'm going to explain to you in a second why I think he made this strategic mistake and what he's really trying to accomplish. It's about politics. We'll get to that in a moment. But to begin with, what was Gavin Newsom proposing this morning? Well, first of all, he's proposing that we amend the Constitution with a 28th Amendment, which would effectively amend the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms. He says that he wants to keep the Second Amendment, but he wants to restrict it, which is nonsense, because this is the mistake that the British made and how the British lost their gun rights by virtue of giving power to the government to restrict gun rights. Now, to begin with, what Gavin Newsom is proposing is four things. He wants to, in his 28th Amendment to the Constitution, number one, raise the minimum wage to purchase a gun to 21. He's obviously not talking about amending the rest of the Constitution that says that 18-year-olds have a right to vote because they could be drafted and sent off to war, which came about during the Vietnam era. But nevertheless, the same people that can be drafted and are allowed to vote are not allowed to purchase a gun until 21 under the 28th Amendment proposed by Gavin Newsom. Number two is universal background checks, which of course is effectively a gun registry and a registry of gun owners. That's presumably what he's trying to get to. The third thing is he wants a reasonable waiting period, whatever that means. Basically, I presume that, they can have a waiting period of 5 years. Why not? If it's in the Constitution, you can have any waiting period you want. You got to wait 5 years before you can get a gun. And last but not least, to ban the civilian purchase of quote-unquote assault weapons, which is, of course, something that they can't do right now because AR-15s are in common use and are owned by tens of millions of Americans. And, of course, we have the Second Amendment. So that is what he's trying to do. So what do I think about this? And why am I actually spending time on this nonsense? Because I think it's important that you know sort of the high-level professional views of what's going on here. Well, let's talk about why Gavin Newsom is doing this, and then we're going to talk about why it won't work. I think the reason why Gavin Newsom is doing this is because he's worried about where the Democratic primary season is going with Joe Biden. I think we can all recognize that President Joe Biden, there's a really good chance that he's not going to be up to the task to ultimately run and win the Democratic national, slot to be the Democratic nominee to be the president in the 2024 presidential election. Maybe he'll get there, but obviously, even if you want him to get there, which I personally don't, but if you did, there's a real chance that he may not make it for health reasons or otherwise. You don't know, or he may just decide he doesn't want to do it. He's already 80, right? So it seems to me that what Gavin Newsom wants to do is make sure he stays in the public eye. He wants to make sure he's in these news cycles because he fears another person. Specifically, we all know that Robert Kennedy Jr. has gotten some real traction. He gets a lot of press. I think he's doing events with Elon Musk on Twitter. A lot of people are talking about his candidacy. A lot of the Democrats are interested in Robert Kennedy Jr. and what he has to say on different topics. I know the Democrats have not coalesced around him or anything like that, but they're definitely serious about him. And we've also seen there's other people out there like Cornel West, who's has declared that he wants to run for the White House. I think he's technically not a Democrat. I think he's running as another kind of progressive group. But the bottom line is there's people out there that are publicly challenging and getting airtime as potential challengers to Joe Biden on the left of the political spectrum. And I think Gavin Newsom is concerned that if he does not remain relevant and does not stay in the mainstream media, does not keep getting talked about, he may wake up one day and, 8 months from now, and all these other people have, jumped ahead of him, and now he's got to make up for lost ground. So I think part of what's going on here with this absurd proposal of the 28th Amendment to cut back on the Second Amendment is he's just trying to stay relevant in the press so people keep talking about him and remember him, because he's trying to run what I think is kind of a shadow presidential campaign that he can jump into in the event that something happens to Joe Biden between now and November 2024, because there's other people sucking up airtime from him, and he's nervous about that. I think that's really what's motivating here. But with that said, we also want to do two things. We want to, of course, take them at their word. I always like to say when, the Iranians or people in the Middle East would jump up and down and fire their AK-47s into the air and scream, "Death to America, death to America," we ought to take them at their word that they actually mean death to America. That's what I've always said. So if the anti-gunners and the Governor Newsoms of the world are literally saying that we want to take away Americans' gun rights, we have to take them at their word and take them seriously, that this is actually what they intend. And if they could get away with it, they would get away with it. So that is, we also have to take it seriously because they're taking it seriously and they want to win. But the good news is this also proves they're losing the war on guns. They're losing. Now, if you recall, about a week or two ago, I explained to you that one of the best pieces of evidence that the anti-gun movement in America is failing, contrary to the press and the mainstream legacy media that talks all about guns all the time. They're failing. And the best evidence I think they're failing is if you look at where the anti-gunners are moving, and you're going to see I'm almost been proven right here by Gavin Newsom's statement. They're actually taking all their resources, and rather than trying to push gun control in a lot of the so-called red states, they're trying, but not as earnestly as what they're really doing, which is going back to deep blue states. These are states where they control all the organs of government. Now, I know there's some states that are more purplish, arguably not as deep blue as like New York, California, and New Jersey, places like Colorado and Oregon and Washington. I understand the reality of, got these big cities in those states. They dominate the rest of the state, which is unfortunate. But the idea is that I think what the anti-gunners are doing, they're going back to the states where the Democrats control, for all intents and purposes, the organs of government, and they're trying to advance as much gun control as possible. That's how we have quote-unquote assault weapon bans in places like Illinois, which has a real serious gun culture in the South of the state. Obviously, these assault weapon bans in places like Washington State, which of course has a pretty earnest gun culture as well, and places like Oregon. These are places that had a lot of guns and gun rights, and there's still gun owners out there, obviously, and it's a still robust gun rights movement, but of course they're being dominated by Democrats in these urban cities and these suburban areas surrounding the urban areas. We see what's going on there. You guys who live out there know this better than I do. So the point is the anti-gunners are going, and they're basically retreating to the states they think they control and giving up on a lot of other states like the Floridas and the Southeast and the like. And the reason why this is significant is because I think Gavin Newsom has essentially admitted this. If you look very carefully, and I'll put a link to this down below, if you click on the links as to where his proposals go, it goes to a website called campaignfordemocracy.com. And I'll put a link to this down below. And if you look at what it says, this is what that says. It says, this is the language from the actual website. It says, "Save this democracy." Quote, "We believe that all patriotic Americans must go on offense in red states." Bing, 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 bing. You hear what I just said? This is the website that Gavin Newsom is linking to with his proposal. I'll read it again. Quote, "We believe that all patriotic Americans must go on offense in red states as well as blue states, bringing the fight to state houses, local communities, electoral battlegrounds, and our nation's capital to save the great American experiment in democracy." Very close quote. The point is that this is, to me, an admission, a concession in some ways, that the anti-gunners and a lot of the progressives are not on the offense in red states. They're playing heavy-duty defense. And again, I think it's not coincidental that Gavin Newsom is linking to this website with this kind of language. I think it goes back to the point I made a couple weeks ago, which is, again, the anti-gun movement, a lot of the progressives are retreating to states that they control. And I think it ultimately shows that we are overall winning. Beyond that, of course, we now know we have 27 states that allow permitless carry. So we know we have over the majority of Americans are supportive of the right to keep and bear arms just by virtue of those 27 states alone, not to mention all the other pretty good gun states that have shall issue permitting regimes and haven't moved to permitless carry, but they're still very good on guns. So again, what is Gavin Newsom trying to accomplish here? I think what he wants to do is to create the United States and create a situation in the United States which is much more akin to Great Britain and the United Kingdom. I've been thinking about doing a whole video, and I need to do this, it's on my list, about how is it that the British lost their right to keep and bear arms, which at one point was a very robust right to keep and bear arms. In fact, we in America inherited the English Declaration of Rights, which included the right to bear arms, and the Supreme Court itself, in cases like Heller and McDonald, have talked about the English Declaration of Rights, which gave people the right to bear arms. And the bottom line is this, and this is very important to you understand this. The Declaration of Rights that the British had back in the late 1600s bound and restricted the ability of the King of England, from taking away the right to bear arms. It did not restrict, it did not apply and limit the ability, and this is key, of Parliament to take away guns in the United Kingdom. Parliament is the equivalent of our Congress. So it seems to me what Gavin Newsom is doing with this proposed 28th Amendment is trying to embrace a sort of English system that says, yeah, you have a right to keep and bear arms, you're going to keep the Second Amendment, but we're going to use the 28th Amendment to give all these governmental powers to government to do what they need to do, and essentially say, yeah, you have the right to keep and bear arms, but we have the power as government to take it away. Because as you know, you and I as Americans, you and I as individuals have rights. Individuals have rights. Governments have powers and authority. And by the way, power and authority is not the same, because I might have the power over someone or the power to do something bad to something, but that doesn't give me the legal or moral authority to do it. So don't confuse the fact that government may have the power to do things. That doesn't mean it has the authority to do it. You know, the Nazi Germans are a perfect example. They had all sorts of power over people that they abused and victimized and murdered. They had power over those people, but obviously they did not have the moral or other authority to do what they said. So always keep in mind that individuals have rights, governments have powers, and if they're properly exercised, those powers are done so with authority. But there's really three distinct concepts: rights, power, and authority. All three separate, and sometimes they interrelate, but not always. So the reason why I bring this up, it seems to me that what Gavin Newsom's trying to do with the 28th Amendment is give power and legal authority, constitutional authority for the government to take away our Second Amendment rights. That's the dynamic that's being played out here. And the last thing I want to point out here before I close, and a lot of people have asked me about this, is there such a thing as an unconstitutional constitutional amendment? Specifically, for example, could you have a constitutional amendment today that outlaws the right to free speech? The right to bear arms? Could you have a constitutional amendment that outlaws the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery? So it seems to me, of course, there is an argument here that there's certain rights that are so fundamental to our society and have been with us for so long that, you know, even if you amended the Constitution, one wonders whether or not that would still be constitutional. That's an interesting academic debate. We don't need to get into here, but there is certainly theoretical debates in, for example, law schools about whether or not you could, in certain instances, have an unconstitutional constitutional amendment. And even if you got rid of the Second Amendment, one wonders whether or not you would still have some sort of right to keep and bear arms under the 9th Amendment, maybe the 10th Amendment, maybe the 14th Amendment, maybe the Privileges and Immunities Clause. One doesn't know, because, of course, there are certain unenumerated rights that are indeed considered, you know, fundamental rights. That's talked about in substantive due process land. But again, we don't need to belabor the point right here, because we understand that this 28th Amendment is going nowhere. But again, it is telling us where the anti-gunners would like to go, and it's also telling that Gavin Newsom wants to be president. He's trying to stay in the limelight so that he doesn't lose ground to his potential political rivals for Joe Biden's slot if Joe Biden cannot go and run and be the president or run for the president in 2024. Okay, folks, hope you learned a little bit something here today at the Four Boxes Diner. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. We'll see you again soon at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.